Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of ITSS Verona's podcast series today on World Order. Dr. Leoni and myself are very thrilled because we have a real special treat. Joining us from the United States, please welcome Professor Ken Schultz. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. We cannot tell you how honored we are to start our series with you. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be here.
Thank you very much. Everyone, Dr. Ken Schultz is professor of political science at Stanford University. He is one of the major experts authoring many books and articles in peer-reviewed journals on international conflict and conflict resolution, with a particular focus on how domestic politics can affect foreign policies. And therefore, without any further ado, Dr. Leoni, the floor is yours. But once again, Professor Schultz, thank you so much once more for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Michele, and thank you very much, Professor Schultz, for joining us. I would like to start by going back a few years from now. And recently, there have been, over the last 10 years, much academic frenzy with regard to the way Obama and Trump have handled U.S. grand strategy. But at the same time, you see scholars arguing that it's since the end of the Cold War, U.S. grand strategy has not really had a clear grand strategic direction. I was wondering, Professor Schultz, if you could share your thoughts with us with regard to that.
Absolutely, I'd love to. So I would say that since the end of the Cold War, of course, there's been a debate in this country about the appropriate means and ends of U.S. foreign policy. I think we can identify a few common threads that emerge in the 1990s as themes that run across several administrations. The belief that the United States still needed to be active in the world, right, rather than retreating into isolation. There was a commitment to building stability through the extension and deepening of existing international organizations. So NATO, the European Union, the World Trade Organization. There's lots of institutions at this time expanding their membership and deepening their responsibilities. And then third, a commitment greater commitment to democracy and the promotion of democracy. As, again, a kind of a keystone of stability in the post-Cold War world. And so I think we see this thread running through a number of different administrations. But of course, there's tensions, there's disagreements. There's disagreements about the appropriate use of military force. In particular, the Iraq War brought to the fore the question of whether military force was an appropriate means for spreading democracy. And then, I think the other issue that's caused problems is that the world hasn't necessarily responded well to, or as one would have hoped. And of course, so China, I think, is the best example of that, where the initial hope in the 1990s was that institutions and interdependence would lead to democratization and lead to more stable relations with China, and that hasn't panned out, right? And that and a number of other challenges have raised the question of whether the grand strategic ideas that came out of the immediate post-Cold War period are sustainable now.
Thank you, Professor. You said that the world, in a way, has changed at some point, in my view, around 2008 and beyond. I mean, we are in a phase of transition, and the geopolitical world order has been changing. But do you think this has caused a degree of continuity between the Obama and the Trump administration, or you see more discontinuity between these two administrations?
Well, I think that both have had to grapple with new challenges that were unanticipated. But on balance, I see there's a lot of discontinuity. It's hard not to see the discontinuities, in part because Trump has in so many ways framed his foreign policy as a repudiation of Obama, right? So while they're dealing with similar challenges, and there's continuity in a couple of ways, the treatment of certain challenges, for example, Iran, clearly Trump came in intending to repudiate the Obama approach of negotiating with the Iranian regime. on climate change, right? A repudiation there of U.S. commitments to those kinds of agreements. With respect to NATO and other allies, of course, the idea of rebalancing defense contributions has been a constant really throughout the history, and Obama griped about European defense spending too. So there's continuity there, but a perception that Trump was willing to kind of go the next step and kind of imply that the Article 5 guarantee was in some ways conditional on appropriate defense levels is a step that no president before has really been willing to take to that same degree. So there are, I think, important breaks, and I think we may see that accelerating going into the future, and particularly if there's a Trump second term.
Was to talk about continuity and tactical changes. Would that be accurate when we look at Obama, when we compare Obama and Trump?
Yeah, yeah, I think that could be a useful formulation. I mean, certain challenges are shared across them, and of course, the issues of China, the issue of terrorism, issues of emerging nuclear powers like North Korea and Iran, absolutely, and many of the basic commitments of American foreign policy didn't change in that regard, right? Managing the rise of China, preventing nuclear challengers, containing terrorism. So those goals don't change across these administrations. But yeah. But the approaches in which to do that, the extent to which you emphasize multilateralism versus unilateralism, those kinds of things I feel have changed more.
Mm-hmm. And given that we have mentioned China already quite a few times over the last few minutes, do you see a new type of Cold War coming up between the US and China?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of it depends on what you mean by a Cold War. I do think that there's going to be a strategic rivalry between the US and China going forward, and it is going to have some similarities with what we think of as the Cold War in terms of think of a global competition for influence. I wouldn't push the analogy too far though, because while there are some military flashpoints, I don't think it has the same escalatory potential globally that the Cold War with the Soviet Union had, and it may also not feature the same ideological rivalry to the same degree that the Cold War did. But yes, competition certainly, and I think that's true regardless of who's the next president.
Yes, and I mean, clearly there are a lot of differences compared to the Cold War. I think the economic interdependence is a very major difference. Although lately we've seen how the battle of narratives and this attempt at delegitimizing the adversary has taken us back to the Cold War. So I guess we really see very important differences, but also very important similarities, and maybe we will understand more in the coming year. Has the battle of narratives over COVID triggered any thoughts on you? What do you make of it?
Well, yes. So I'm actually reminded. So Tom Christensen has this book called Useful Adversaries about the Korean War between and particularly the U.S.-China rivalry. And his central thesis there is that the rivalry is useful for domestic politics in both countries. Like they're useful adversaries for the leaders. And I think that dynamic is coming back to the fore right now. President Trump is going to need conflict with China as a way to deflect responsibility and blame for the outcome here. And so in that sense, China is going to be a useful adversary for us going forward. And so that means that there is this kind of domestic political driver of conflict that's on top of kind of geopolitical considerations.
Thank you, Professor Schultz. And given that we have arrive to the big issue of our times, really, COVID-19 and coronavirus. I'll hand it over to Michele, who will have a few questions on that.
Thank you very much, Zeno. Professor, extremely quickly, what do you think about how the government, the central government, is handling the crisis in the United States? And after that, do you think that how the central government is actually handling this might have an impact on the next election, the next big election coming up? And if so, how? To what extent? Thank you.
I'll be blunt. I think the central government has bungled this badly and not understood its appropriate role in a national crisis like this. I mean, the states were left on their own to make decisions, to compete with one another in the marketplace for protective equipment, to compete with one another in the market for testing. It is completely counter to the whole idea of having a federal government whose job is to arrange for collective outcomes under these kinds of situations. I feel that Trump, from very early on, very much did not want to have his fingerprints on this, did not want to claim any responsibility for this, and he punted to the states in a way that I think has been really problematic. And it's continued. It's kind of distressing to watch the continued failure to provide the kind of basic public necessities, such as testing and PPE equipment and whatnot, so that we can safely reopen this country. And then, so your question is this going to affect the election? I mean, it would be startling if it didn't, right? I mean, so, there's been historically lots of efforts to model presidential elections in the United States. And we know that there are two very big determinants of the likelihood that an incumbent gets reelected. The first is the state of the economy in the kind of 3 quarters leading up to the November election, and the second one is deaths in foreign wars, right? So it turns out that the two variables actually can do very well in predicting incumbent vote share in the election. Well, so of course this is an unprecedented situation. None of our models capture this precisely. But in terms of the state of the economy and the level of casualties, deaths from this disease, one would have to expect that Trump would struggle to get reelected. I mean, it's hard to imagine what democratic accountability means if a president could deliver this poor an outcome and still get reelected.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.